Spain is a country many people believe they already understand. Flamenco, bullfighting, sunlit coastlines, ancient castles, Roman ruins, Islamic palaces, Catholic monarchs, and the legacy of a global empire. From the outside, Spain appears to have a clear and familiar history. A story that seems well documented, well explained, and already settled. But beneath that familiar image lies a much older story. A story hidden not in books or monuments, but inside the DNA of modern Spanish people. It begins long before Spain existed as a nation. Before Madrid, before Barcelona, before Seville, before Granada, before Rome, before the Moors, before Christianity, Islam, or written history. When scientists began studying ancient DNA from human remains found across Iberia, they uncovered something remarkable. Spanish people were not formed by one single ancient population. They were created through many layers of migration, conquest, survival, and cultural mixing.
So the real question is not simply who are Spanish people? The deeper question is how many times was Iberia transformed before modern Spain emerged? Because Spanish ancestry is not the result of one origin. It is a complex mosaic, a genetic record shaped by different peoples arriving at different moments in history. Some came from the north. Some arrived from the east. Some crossed the Mediterranean. Some came over mountains. Some were hunters. Some were farmers. Some were warriors. Some were traders. And some were conquerors. Each group left something behind. Their genes, their languages, their customs, their appearance, their beliefs, and their memory. To understand Spanish ancestry, we must first understand why Iberia became such an important meeting point in human history. And that begins with geography.
Spain occupies the Iberian Peninsula in the southwestern corner of Europe. At first glance, it may seem like the edge of the continent. But historically, Iberia was never truly isolated. It was a crossroads. To the north, the Pyrenees Mountains separated Iberia from the rest of Europe. They were difficult to cross, but never impossible. For thousands of years, people moved through them. Hunters, farmers, Celts, merchants, armies, and migrants. To the south, only a narrow stretch of water separates Spain from North Africa. At its closest point, the Strait of Gibraltar is only about 14 kilometers wide. For ancient movement, that was not an impossible barrier. It was a bridge. And to the east, the Mediterranean connected Iberia with Italy, Greece, North Africa, and the Near East. The sea was not simply water. It was a highway of civilization. It carried people, ideas, religions, languages, and ancestry. This is why Spanish DNA is so layered. Iberia was never a closed world. It was a meeting place between Europe, Africa, and the Mediterranean. And the first deep chapter begins after the Ice Age. Around 12,000 years ago, after the last Ice Age, the climate of Europe began to change. Glaciers slowly retreated, forests returned, animals moved into new territories, and human groups followed. The people living in Iberia during this period were hunter-gatherers. They did not farm, they did not build cities, they did not leave behind kingdoms or written records. They survived by hunting animals, fishing rivers, gathering wild plants, and moving with the seasons. Scientists often refer to these early people as Western hunter-gatherers. Their societies were simple compared to later civilizations, but genetically, they represent one of the oldest human layers in Europe.
And when researchers studied ancient remains from this period, the results challenged many modern assumptions. Some early European hunter-gatherers likely had darker skin and light-colored eyes. In Iberia, one famous ancient genome suggested a combination that surprised many people: dark skin and blue eyes. This shows that the physical appearance we now associate with Europeans was not always common in ancient Europe. Many of those traits arrived later, carried by new populations entering the continent.
The earliest people of Iberia were not Romans. They were not Celts. They were not Visigoths. And they were not Moors. They were ancient hunter-gatherers whose roots reached back to the end of the Ice Age. Their way of life eventually disappeared. Their communities were absorbed by later populations. But their DNA did not vanish completely. A small but meaningful part of modern Spanish ancestry still traces back to these early inhabitants. And one group in particular preserves stronger echoes of older Iberian ancestry: the Basques. The Basque people live mainly in northern Spain and southwestern France. Their language, Euskera, is one of Europe's greatest linguistic mysteries. It is not related to Spanish. It is not related to French. It is not Latin, and it does not belong to the Indo-European language family. It stands apart. Genetically, the Basques are also distinctive. They are not unchanged from the Ice Age. No modern population is pure or frozen in time. But compared with many neighboring groups, the Basques preserve stronger traces of older Iberian layers. Their story is shaped by mountains, isolation, language, and survival. But even the Basques were not untouched by history, because soon Iberia would be transformed by a new wave of people: farmers. Around 7,500 years ago, farming spread into Iberia. This was one of the most important transformations in human history. People began cultivating crops, raising animals, building permanent villages, storing food, and creating larger, more stable communities. But farming did not simply appear because local hunter-gatherers invented it overnight. The evidence suggests that agriculture was brought by people moving westward from Anatolia, the region we now call Turkey. These early farmers spread across Europe through different routes. Some moved through the Balkans. Others traveled along the Mediterranean coast. Eventually, they reached Iberia. And when they arrived, they brought more than crops and animals. They brought a new genetic profile. This was not a minor cultural influence. It was a major population transformation. The older hunter-gatherers did not disappear immediately, but they were gradually absorbed into expanding farming communities. The farmers were more numerous. Their food supply supported population growth. Their villages expanded, and over generations, their ancestry became one of the strongest foundations of modern Spanish DNA. A major part of modern Spanish ancestry traces back to these Neolithic farmers from Anatolia. Not to Rome, not to the Visigoths, not to the Moors, but to farmers who entered Europe thousands of years before Spain existed. These early farmers also helped reshape the physical appearance of Europe. They carried genetic traits that later became associated with the classic Mediterranean appearance: darker hair, brown eyes, and skin tones that became lighter over time compared with earlier hunter-gatherer populations. So when people today imagine a Southern European look, part of that deep origin may lie outside Europe itself, in ancient Anatolia. The hunter-gatherers gave Iberia its earliest foundation, but the farmers created one of its strongest genetic layers. Then, around 4,500 years ago, another major population movement arrived, and this one changed Iberia in a far more dramatic way. It did not only add ancestry, it reshaped the male line of the peninsula. This was the steppe migration. Around 4,500 years ago, a new population began spreading across Europe from the Pontic-Caspian steppe
a vast grassland region north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. These people were connected to steppe herding cultures, including the Yamnaya horizon. They were highly mobile. They used horses and wagons. They moved with herds. And they carried a genetic ancestry unlike the farmers and hunter-gatherers already living in Western Europe. Across Europe, their arrival became one of the most important prehistoric events ever recorded in ancient DNA. But in Iberia, the effect was especially dramatic. Ancient DNA studies show that before this migration, a male lineage known as R1b M269 was rare or almost absent in Iberia. After the arrival of steppe-related groups, especially through the Bell-Beaker cultural world, that lineage became extremely common. Today, R1b is one of the dominant paternal lineages among Spanish men. This suggests that something profound happened. The paternal ancestry of Iberia changed very rapidly. In simple terms, many older male lineages were replaced. The entire population was not replaced. Much farmer and hunter-gatherer ancestry remained, but the male line changed on a remarkable scale. Why did this happen? That remains debated. It may have involved conquest. It may have involved social dominance. It may have involved elite male groups taking control. It may also have involved violence. DNA cannot show every detail of what happened, but the speed and scale of this transformation suggest it was more than peaceful cultural exchange. It was a major social and genetic turning point.
The steppe migration may also be connected to the spread of Indo-European languages. Most European languages today belong to the Indo-European family. Spanish is part of that family. Spanish developed from Latin. Latin was the language of Rome. But Latin itself was an Indo-European language, and the deeper origins of Indo-European speech may reach back to steppe populations. So when someone speaks Spanish today, the visible historical path leads back to Rome. But at a deeper level, the linguistic roots may extend all the way back to people who lived on the grasslands north of the Black Sea. That is the power of ancient DNA. It connects modern identities to worlds that existed thousands of years before recorded history. By the Iron Age, Iberia already carried its major prehistoric layers: hunter-gatherer ancestry, Anatolian farmer ancestry, and steppe-related ancestry. But history was not finished. The next major layer came from Celtic-speaking peoples. During the Iron Age, Celtic-speaking peoples entered parts of Iberia, especially the north, west, and central regions of the peninsula. They mixed with existing Iberian populations and created cultures historians call Celt-Iberian. These were not simply Celts in the modern popular sense of Ireland or Scotland. They were mixed societies, part Iberian, part Celtic, part local, and part connected to wider Atlantic and continental Europe. The Celt-Iberians became known for their warrior traditions, fortified settlements, metalwork, and resistance to Roman expansion. In regions such as Galicia and Asturias, echoes of Celtic and Atlantic European influence remained especially strong. Even today, northwestern Spain has cultural traditions that feel connected to the Atlantic world. Bagpipes, stone villages, green landscapes, and a regional identity shaped by both Iberian and Celtic memory. But the next major force would not come from prehistory. It would come from one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known: Rome. In 218 BC, Roman forces arrived in Iberia during the Second Punic War. At first, Rome came to fight Carthage, but eventually, Rome stayed. The conquest of Iberia was long and difficult. Some regions resisted Roman control for generations. But over time, the peninsula became part of the Roman world. The Romans called it Hispania, and Roman rule lasted for centuries. This changed Iberia permanently. Roads were built, cities expanded, Latin spread, Roman law took root. Trade connected Iberia to Italy, North Africa, Gaul, Greece, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Roman soldiers, merchants, administrators, slaves, and settlers moved throughout the empire.
Because Hispania was fully integrated into that imperial network, it also experienced genetic movement. During the Roman period, some Iberian populations show increased ancestry connected to the central and eastern Mediterranean. In simple terms, parts of Iberia became more genetically connected to Italians, Greeks, and other Mediterranean populations. But Rome's greatest legacy was not only genetic. It was linguistic. It was cultural. And it would shape Spain for centuries.
The Latin spoken in Hispania did not disappear after Rome declined. It evolved. It blended with local speech. It changed across regions. And over centuries, it became the Romance languages of the peninsula: Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, Galician, and others. Modern Spanish identity owes a profound debt to Rome: its language, its legal traditions, its cities, its roads, and many aspects of its social structure. But Rome did not erase what came before. It added another layer to an already complex population. And when the Roman Empire weakened, another people stepped into power: the Visigoths. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Germanic groups moved into former Roman territories. In Iberia, the most important of these groups were the Visigoths. They ruled much of the peninsula from the 5th to the early 8th century. Politically, their influence was significant. They established a kingdom. They shaped law. They influenced elite culture. And they left traces in names, traditions, and institutions. But genetically, their impact appears to have been much smaller than their political power. This reveals an important truth about history. The people who rule a land are not always the people who genetically transform it. A small elite can dominate politics without becoming a major part of the wider population's ancestry. The Visigoths ruled Iberia, but they did not genetically remake Iberia in the way Neolithic farmers or steppe migrants had done. Then, in 711 AD, the peninsula changed again. An army crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and one of the most influential chapters in Spanish history began: Al-Andalus. In 711 AD, Muslim forces crossed from North Africa into Iberia. Within a few years, the Visigothic kingdom collapsed. Large parts of the peninsula came under Islamic rule. This region became known as Al-Andalus, and its influence lasted for nearly 8 centuries in different parts of Iberia. 8 centuries, longer than many modern nations have existed. During this period, Iberia became one of the great centers of the medieval world. Cities such as Córdoba, Seville, and Granada became famous for learning, architecture, agriculture, medicine, poetry, trade, and scholarship. Arabic words entered local languages. New crops and irrigation methods spread. Mosques, palaces, gardens, and libraries became part of the landscape. And people moved across the region. North Africans, Arabs, Berbers, Middle Eastern groups, local converts, Christians, Jews, and Muslims all existed in complex relationships across time and place. This period left a real genetic signal. Modern Spanish populations show North African and Middle Eastern ancestry, though the amount varies by region. In southern Spain, especially Andalusia, the signal is stronger. That is historically understandable. Andalusia was at the heart of Al-Andalus for centuries. In northern regions, especially the Basque country, the signal is much lower. Those areas were less deeply integrated into Islamic rule and remained more connected to Christian northern kingdoms. But genetics is not the same as religion. North African ancestry does not automatically mean Moorish identity in a cultural or religious sense. Many Muslims in medieval Iberia were local Iberians who converted to Islam. And after Christian kingdoms expanded southward during the Reconquista, many Muslims converted to Christianity. Others were expelled. Others blended into local populations. When Granada fell in 1492, the political story of Al-Andalus ended. But the genetic story remained. Because DNA does not obey political borders. It continues through families, quietly, generation after generation. So what does modern Spanish DNA look like when all these layers are viewed together? It is not a single origin. It is a mosaic. Modern Spanish ancestry generally includes a major Neolithic farmer layer from Anatolia, a significant hunter-gatherer layer from Ice Age Europe, a major Bronze Age steppe-related layer, Mediterranean ancestry connected to Rome and later movements, smaller Germanic traces, and North African and Middle Eastern ancestry connected especially to Al-Andalus. But these layers are not distributed equally everywhere. Spain is deeply regional. The Basques preserve one of the most distinctive genetic profiles, with lower North African ancestry and stronger older Iberian layers. Andalusia shows a stronger North African and Middle Eastern signal. Galicia and Asturias show stronger Atlantic and steppe-related patterns. Catalonia and Valencia reflect broader Mediterranean connections. Central Spain often sits closer to the national average. This means there is no single genetic story of Spain. There are many Spanish stories, shaped by region, by mountains, by coastlines, by empire, by migration, and by survival.
So who do Spanish people really descend from? The answer is not one people. Spanish people descend from Ice Age hunter-gatherers, from Anatolian farmers, from Bronze Age steppe herders, from Celtic-speaking communities, from Romans, from Visigoths, from North African and Middle Eastern populations connected to Al-Andalus, and from countless local communities who lived, mixed, adapted, and passed their ancestry forward. Spain was never genetically simple, and that is what makes its history so powerful. Its identity was not built on purity. It was built through movement, contact, conflict, migration, conquest, adaptation, and survival. DNA does not make Spain less Spanish. It makes Spain's story deeper. Because inside modern Spanish ancestry is not one chapter. It is an entire archive, a living record of Europe, Africa, and the Mediterranean world meeting on one peninsula, meeting. So the next time you think of Spain, do not only think of flamenco, castles, beaches, or empires. Think of the ancient bones beneath the soil, the hunters who survived after the Ice Age, the farmers who crossed the sea, the horsemen from the steppe, the Celtic warriors, the Roman roads, the Visigothic kings, the mosques of Cordoba, the mountains of the Basques, the fall of Granada, and the millions of ordinary people whose lives became part of one of Europe's most fascinating genetic stories.